Fast am I. It's great to be back here. As was mentioned, I think I last gave a talk here a couple of years ago about the folklore of Port Erin. And of all the parishes in the Isle of Man, of course, Rushen has the richest store of folklore. And so it's great to be back this evening talking about a bit more of that, this time in relation to Port St Mary. Now, last time when I spoke, we were just coming towards the end of our, at that point, top secret project to produce this book, A Guide to the Folklore Sites of the Isle of Man, which was a great project working with those two Manx heroes, Katie Newton and Sam Hudson. And together we visited all of the folklore sites which we know of in the parish of Rushen. And this will be what I'm calling on this evening, as well as adding in some new sites which hopefully would appear in a future publication, and also drawing some connections which are the sorts of things you couldn't put in a book like this. And so hopefully there'll be something for everyone in tonight's talk. But before I begin, I need to just mention two historical figures. Of course, Carl Roeder and Edward Farragher. Roeder was a German-born, Manchester-based folklorist who used his holidays as one should, coming to the Isle of Man, collecting folklore. And he worked very closely with Edward Farragher, who was a fisherman, farmer, poet from Caillagh, and he went around collecting in folklore, which he would then send to Roeder. And together they worked on publications which became some of the most important ever produced of Manx folklore, including the 1904 Manx Notes and Queries, which was republished in 2019 as Ghosts, Bugganes and Fairy Pigs. Good title that, unfortunately not mine, but there you go. And it's thanks to figures like Roeder and Farragher that we have the folklore that we do from back then. And the Isle of Man owes them so much to people like this who don't scoff at folklore but recognise its place at the heart of Manx people and the places in which we live. And it's a wonderful thing that we have people like this back then and also in our own age. Thanks be for them. And their work will be beneath so much of what I'm talking about this evening, including on our first stop in talking about giants. Now, hopefully everyone will enjoy some of the stories I pull upon this evening, but also I hope that everyone will leave having learnt a few things about Manx folklore. One of which, or the first of which, is that Manx folklore isn't stuck in stone. It's constantly changing and evolving as we, the Manx people, change and evolve. And giants are a good example of this, because today giants don't feature that prominently in our folklore, but 300 years ago they featured very prominently. And this is shown nicely in the work of George Waldron. He was writing in the 1720s, and his book is full of giants. For instance, the story of a giant's skull being dug up at Kirkcarbery, or him witnessing a giant's shin bone being dug up in Old Kirkbraden. And these are two nice examples because they show the fact that giants are normally beneath the ground these days, either dead and buried or lying in wait, ready to come back. The place to find those is normally under Castle Rushen, but more of that later. Closer to home, of course, we learnt last time that Fairy Hill was created by giants, for giants, because the giant husband died and the giant wife brought the earth in her apron and dumped it on him to form this mound. And this is the second feature of giant stories traditionally in the Isle of Man. Giants underground, but also explaining features of the landscape which otherwise don't really have an explanation. And so this is often, giants are often used to explain why there are the large stones we find all around the Manx landscape, such as this one, of course, just down from Ballacraggan Farm, just outside Port St Mary. We'll all know it, I'm sure, and hopefully everyone will know it by the name of being the Giant's Quoiting Stone, as it's marked on the maps. But normally, if you were to actually read the historic books which mention this, you'll find it normally spoken of in the plural. You can see it there in the middle, the giants' quoiting stones. And there's a good reason for this, and it comes from the story, because where it came from were two competing giants. They were up on the top of Mule Hill, arguing about who was strongest, and so they decided to see who could throw these enormous stones the furthest. And the winning giant, of course, threw the stone to where it stands today, just below Ballacraggan. And so we all know this stone, but perhaps not many people will be aware that the losing giant in that day, their stone is also standing. And this is marked on the old maps, on the earliest OS maps from the 1860s was when it was surveyed. You'll see there are two giants' quoiting stones marked on here. And this is what the other giant's quoiting stone looks like. When it first landed a long time ago on the side of Cronk-Skibalt, it was just on the open hill land. But when Port St Mary was developed somewhat later, with Cronk Road being built, it was built within someone's garden. And so very few people today perhaps will be aware that this other giant's quoiting stone exists, let alone will they ever have seen it. But this isn't the only version of the story. There are different versions, of course. This is a great thing about folklore, that you can find different versions and a different story of where it's developing and going to. But Carl Roeder published an account in Yn Lior Mananach, in which he described a competition between three giants. And they were up on the top of South Barrule, again, arguing about who was the strongest. And there were three giants this time, and they threw stones. And of course, the one which went the furthest was the one which landed on Cronk-Skibalt. That was the strongest giant. And then came the one who threw it to Ballacraggan, and the third giant, who lost that day, threw it only to the Four Roads. And this explains why we have Ballacreenie Cross there. And whenever you find these sorts of large standing stones all over the Isle of Man, almost normally you will find that giants are behind them, such as with these stones, which would suggest that were you living in the time of giants, it would be a very dangerous place to be, I imagine. Now, Ballacraggan Corner, or the crossroads here, is a very good place to kind of begin our journey into the village, because this is a place renowned for the strange and uncanny. In this instance, particularly with Bugganes. Now, when one says Bugganes, the first thing I feel like I need to do is to say, not like that fella from St Trinian's. That Buggane who hounded tailors, threw off roofs, and apparently tore off his head to throw and explode. It's all very, very strange. This, to be honest, doesn't feel very Manx. It feels, yeah, it's very much an outlier. If you want to find a good Manx Buggane, you'd be better looking around Rushen for the sorts of stories you find here. And we know this because of all the stories backed up by Sophia Morrison, because in her preface to the book you'll all have, I'm sure, her Manx Fairy Tales, in the preface she tells us what Bugganes are like. They are, of course, horrible and cruel creatures. They can appear in any shape they please, as ogres with huge heads or great fiery eyes, or without any heads at all, as small dogs who grow larger and larger as you watch them until they are larger than elephants, when perhaps they turn into the shape of men or disappear into nothing, as horned monsters or anything they choose. And this shape-shifting quality of Bugganes is something missed entirely with that Moran fella, but it's very much there in the Bugganes we find around about Ballacraggan. They can be anything they choose. And so this is my go-to as an example of how to imagine Bugganes, this ragbag of wonderfully weird things. There was a fella coming home from the Four Roads late one night, and towards Ballacraggan he came across a black thing in the road, and he went to kick it. But his foot didn't touch anything, and then the thing began to grow and grow and grow until it was the size of a horse, and then it began to come at him. And he pulled out his knife and backed off slowly until he came to a house, where he dashed inside and slammed the door and stayed there till morning. Now, a horse seems like a sensible thing to appear as, I think, but you don't need to be sensible. They can appear as anything they like. And so they might appear as two strange calves in the road. And this was encountered by a fella walking near dawn, near the crossroads, and he saw these two strange calves and realised that these were not natural things. And so he climbed over the hedge to get away from them, and he crossed over towards Plantation Road. But when he came out there by the road, the two calves were there in the road, and he tried to go another way, and they were there again. And so he decided just to stay safe in the field. And he waited until dawn, when he saw the two calves walk off towards the port and then disappear. Now, two strange calves doesn't sound particularly threatening, I don't think, but they were unsettling at least. And this is probably the same with the next story of the giant greyhound Bugganes. A fella was coming up from the crossroads up Plantation Road at about 11 p.m. on a bright moonlit night, when a very tall beast, like a giant greyhound, passed across the road in front of him and went through a gate, not opening the gate nor going over the gate, but through the gate. And when the fella came to the opening in the hedge, he saw this giant greyhound just standing there in the middle of the field. A very strange thing. And these are all animals, but as we learned, they don't need to be animals. And a good example of this was the one where a woman was chased up Plantation Road, and looking over her shoulder, somewhat frightened, she was able to see this thing, but she could not tell what it was like. It had no shape nor form, but was like a stack, or like one of the turf stacks the old men used to make. I'm not too sure what that is, but how strange. And I should reiterate that all of these are categorised as Bugganes, not by me, but by Roeder and Farragher. And there's a lot more from around here, which I will insist on going through just to demonstrate what a hotspot this is for Bugganes. And they get weirder, don't worry, because they cease to be objects at all as such, really. There was a fella coming home from Balkilferrick one evening when he came across a fire in the road, and he recognised that this was not just some normal natural fire, but a Buggane, apparently. And so he climbed over the hedge off to Plantation Road and away, and looking back he could still see this fire burning in the road. Admittedly, this does actually just sound like a fire in the road. And by the description, it sounds like it could have been at the crossroads, which is interesting from a folklore perspective, because a fire at the crossroads is a very good way of getting rid of the evil eye, which would make your cattle sick. And so perhaps what really was happening here was that a farmer, perhaps a Balacragan, was trying to get rid of sickness on his cattle. Who knows? But if it was an actual Buggane in the form of fire, this wouldn't be the only time it happened. Because there were some fellas coming up from the port at about 1 a.m. on a Saturday, going up towards Four Roads, when they were passed by a great big stack of fire coming up from the port up towards Four Roads, where there was a group of drunk men arguing. And when the stack of fire reached the Four Roads, all of the argument ceased and the stack of fire disappeared. And so this is a very good demonstration, I think, of the enormous range of what Bugganes are, or how they can appear, or how ready people are to classify almost anything as a Buggane, and how many have been encountered over the years by Balacragan there. And Roeder even mentions that it was scarcely safe to venture abroad at night because of all the Bugganes, which makes sense. But pay attention at this point. He gives us 3 ways to escape from an encounter with a Buggane. By running away. a quick prayer, or a retreat across the hedge banks where the Bugganes' power apparently ceased. And in stories so far, we've met running away and climbing over the hedge. And the final story I'll give you relates to a good prayer. And this was saved to last because it's, for me, the most frightening and the most exciting. There was a fella coming home from Port St Mary via Ballacregan crossroads, and he heard a noise in the roadside field. And I quote, "He thought the mountains had opened or split asunder, and he saw something like a bear going round the field, as fast as if it had been flying, and it was shouting, and he thought it was echoing in Flegic, and in a moment it stood in the road before him, and he was standing by the hedge. The monster put his paws on the hedge, one each side of him, and his mouth opened before his eyes, and he could see his big mouth ready to gobble him. And he put his hands in his pocket to get out his knife, but he could not get it or his hand out, and there he was standing, trembling, expecting to be devoured any moment. And the monster opened its mouth big enough to swallow him up, and he began to pray, and in a moment it was gone like a flash of lightning." So watch out there if you're going back via Ballacregan this evening. Now, I think it's probably sensible to leap from the terrifying thing that are Bugganes to something rather less threatening, like King Orry. Now, did you know that King Orry had his castle just outside Port St Mary? So says the folklore anyway. We'll all know Strathallan Castle, I'm sure, but perhaps not everyone will be aware that it was built on top of an ancient earthwork, as it's called. And by the descriptions, this appears to be an Iron Age promontory fort, where you have these banks and ditches cutting off a promontory from the rest of the Isle of Man, making this easy place to defend, this nice fortification. And these are known all over the Isle of Man, from Mackald right down and around up to Michael again. Places such as Close na Cholach in Arbury, or Burraned down near the Sound. And we know that from some sites they have a long history, such as at Cronknamerriw in Santon. This was, we know, built in the Iron Age, but then reused during the Norse period, hence this later longhouse built in the middle of it. And so it makes sense that perhaps the Norse or King Orry had a castle built within this older fortification at Strathallan Castle as we know it today. And indeed, the folklore would tell us that this was King Orry's castle, his actual castle here, and even that this was the first and the real castle Rushen, of course. Now, Orry, or Godred Crovan, used to have his name on an awful lot of folklore in the Isle of Man, and some of which we know and some of which today we've kind of forgotten. Of course, we'll all know King Orry's grave just on the edge of Laxey, but fewer will perhaps know that Caillagh Erd or Caillagh Ard is quite a modern name on that site in Mackald. An older name was King Orry's Castle, and this is how it appears on the earliest OS maps. And often when you meet King Orry in the stories, he's given giant stature. And so we'll find him going around doing things like throwing enormous rocks, of course. And he threw an enormous rock from up on the top of South Barrule down towards St Mark's, where his wife was trying to run away from his murderous rage. Unfortunately, unsuccessfully, because she was squished just outside St Mark's. And there's lots and lots of stories of King Orry all over the island, but actually very few from Rushen, which is a bit of a shame, because if he was better used here in folklore, then probably we'd find King Orry attached to the giant's quoiting stones, I would imagine. But at least we do have one site in the parish linked to King Orry, his castle. And apparently also in the folklore, there is an underground passage from here all the way through to Castle Rushen. But if you ever do come across this passage, I would suggest not going down it, because under the castle is where you might expect to come across giants. And accounts of these giants, one crushed a plough in its fist, thinking he was shaking someone's hand, and other people escaped with their lives only thanks to the fact that the giants were sleeping when they visited. So, take care. It seems like a lot of what I'm doing this evening is giving warnings about things you didn't know to be frightened of. And that's going to continue with my next one, which is about the Moddey Doo, or a Moddey Doo. Because, of course, there are lots and lots of Moddey Doo all over the Isle of Man. We'll all know that one from Peel Castle, who strolls around and frightens soldiers to death when they're foolish enough to go down the dark passage on their own. And it's great that this story is so well known, but it rather obscures all the other Moddey Doo stories which are out there, and there are a lot, such as well as at the castle, there's also a story in the city of Peel itself, St John's, Glen May, Kirkmichael, Ballaugh Glen, over the Sulby Valley, at the Door, on the edges of Ramsey at Milne Town and the Morach, Glenmona in Mackald, the Ballarich Road, Ballacrint, over Laxey, up the mountain road, off the Ballamortha Strait, close to Ronnig, Castletown, Balladool, Colby Glen, etc. And I could actually go on, but I think you get the point. And these come in various forms. They can be ominous or unnerving otherworldly beasts that you want to be very nervous of or frightened of. Or, Moddey Doo can sometimes be a forewarning of something bad happening, like a death. Or, thirdly, they might appear in places where the spirit of an evil person is lingering where they were executed. And this is known, for instance, at the Hanging Hills outside Ramsey, Castletown and Kirkmichael. Now, sadly, we don't know which version of the Moddey Doo we have down here. But we do know that probably, says the books, this patch of the coast derives its name from a Moddey Doo. This is Laa'l Ivortha. Laa'l Ivortha, the hollow of the dog. And sadly, however, we've received no stories of Moddey Doo here. And so all we have is just a link from the place to the creature. And so it's left to us to imagine the sorts of encounters that might have gone on here with Moddey Doo with people in the past. And probably would be wise to be vigilant here also. Now, from Laa'l Ivortha, it's a short distance down past the Mona's Queen Memorial to Caillagh Point. Now, the etymology of Caillagh Point seems quite straightforward, because you can just replace the K with a C and you end up with the place name. And you end up with the surname. However, this is complicated by the fact that 100 or so years ago, it wasn't pronounced as Caillagh Point, but as Caillagh Point. And if it does derive from the surname, then this would make very little sense. And this has led people to believe that rather the place gets its name from a Caillagh linked to a particular time of the year. Now, a Caillagh is an old woman, and in parts of Ireland, the word is used as a friendly term of endearment to an older woman. However, in the Isle of Man, as it is in Scotland and other parts of Ireland, it refers to a mountain hag. So be careful of how you use the word. And this is sometimes translated into English as witch, but very poorly, because you shouldn't think of the pointy-hatted broomstick sort of witch, but rather the sort of witch you might find in Hansel and Gretel, this older woman lurking in the wilderness looking to eat people. And there's a nice story, well, nice is a funny word, but a good story of this from Glen Chas. A young fellow was out late at night and he was coming home across a field when he saw something black against the hedge, and he thought it was an item of clothing, so he went to pick it up. But the thing got up of itself and was in the form of an old woman, and she came towards him, grinning fearfully and opening her mouth wide enough to swallow him. The fella, wisely, ran away and was in a very bad way for 6 to 7 months after this. And this is a very old idea, this Caillagh idea, and you meet it in stories from our neighbouring Celtic countries and also in older stories here in the Isle of Man. For instance, you can find stories of the Caillagh living up on the top of Cronk and Orry Laa'l, or just over into Arbury at Balladooel, for instance. But the Caillagh which we have here, just outside Port St Mary, is not very threatening other than to the weather. And she's been known by various names, such as Caillagh na Gríosaigh, Caillagh na Fairseach, Caillagh na Ferg, Caillagh na Brasnag, or Caillagh na Gromach. And it's this last one that she is perhaps best known in the connection to the story I'll talk about now. It means the Caillagh of the gloominess, and this relates to the weather. The story is that she comes from Ireland, and they didn't really appreciate her there, and so they threw her into the sea to drown her. But being a Caillagh, she declined to drown, and instead bobbed across the sea to the Isle of Man, where she came ashore on the 1st of February, on Laa'l Breise. And ever since then, the weather for the season following Laa'l Breise is determined on that morning in relation to this Caillagh who once came here. And the way it works is, if it is fine dry weather on the 1st of February, then the Caillagh will be able to gather up sticks for her fire, which will mean that it will be bad weather thereafter. And contrarise, if it is bad and wet on the 1st of February, it will be fine weather for the season ahead. And so always we'll be wanting a bit of rain on Laa'l Breise on the 1st of February to make sure that it's good going ahead. And this is all in relation to that Caillagh who came ashore here, I think, on the edge of Port St Mary. Isn't that wonderful? Now, this probably gives us an excuse to have a small sojourn into calendar customs connected to the port. And Manx has some wonderful names for the seasons because they link often to the, wonderful names for the months because they link to the seasons. For instance, January is Jerrygyari, or end of winter, is how it translates. And so, of course, the next month, February, is Toshacht Ari, start of spring. Isn't that lovely and clear? And this is where Laa'l Breise sits at this join between two different seasons. And this is where most of the important points in the Manx calendar sit, not in the midpoints of seasons, but at the joins between the different points. And this is a feature across the Celtic nations, this importance of these points of the calendar. And these are liminal times, times when normal boundaries begin to break down and we're able to catch a glimpse of things beyond our own everyday world. And this includes being able to capture a glimpse of the shadow the future casts ahead of itself, if we know what we're doing. And this is particularly open to us at Hopchinay, where we might carry out certain divination practices to try and see the future. And this is something open to anyone who's willing to do these sorts of things. And one of these divination practices was collected, of course, from Ballacragan. Love that place. And here we learn from Rodo and Farragut that the divination method was to steal a salt herring from your neighbour, though not from the barrel, roast it on the pipe of the bellows, eat every bit of it, including the bones, head and eyes, go to bed backwards, and you would dream of your future spouse. Now, I don't know if anyone lives in a house close to Ballacregan dating back to that sort of period, then perhaps it was from your house that these heron were stolen back in the day. Isn't that a lovely thought? But if that particular divination method isn't to your taste, then there is another way recorded by many people, and it was to fill your mouth with water from a well which never runs dry. In some accounts, you also need a pinch of salt in each hand. And then you go to your neighbour's house and listen in secretly to their conversation. And the first name mentioned is that of your future spouse. And I like this story because Edward Farragut speaks about it in relation to his own home there in Caillagh, because his father, Farragut's father, disturbed two young women at their door at Hoptunay who were doing this on his doorstep. And I would very much like to go back in time to listen in to that conversation. Oh, it would have been wonderful. Now, incidentally, the collection from Ballacregan Farm goes on to give a cure for nightmares, in case you need it. And it is, get a hold shell or stone, tie a piece of string to it and tie it to your bed, after which the nightmares would not return. There you are. I prepared this prop earlier, so if anyone has nightmares, please feel free to come and take it. Now, we just mentioned Edward Farragut's father, and he's the source of one of the best accounts of a calendar custom that I know of, and it relates to the Laa'l Vain, which of course took place during the Caillagh Omagach. Now, the Caillagh Omagach, Caillagh Omagach is a fortnight which takes place from before Christmas through to into the new year, when one should put aside all the work that you can put aside and instead devote your time to eating, feasting, drinking, partying, dancing, etc. And as the name would suggest, foolishness is a very important part of this. And so you find lots of wonderful customs around this time of year. And the ones which have survived very well are the most foolish and fun, and also ones which might raise you some money to go take down the pub, including things like Hunt the Wren, or the Mollig Bands, or the Fiddlers, or the White Boys, or, of course, the Laa'l Vain. And the Laa'l Vain translates as the white mare, the mare in terms of the female horse. And this is related to similar traditions in neighbouring lands, most famously the Mary Lloyd in Wales, but also the identically named but slightly different tradition in Ireland of the Laa'l Vain. And there are sadly very few accounts from the Isle of Man of what the Laa'l Vain really was. Most of them feel second or third hand, really, but there is one brilliant account in Edward Farragut, where he talks about his own father's experiences, well, his and his father's experiences. And here we learn that the young men used at Christmas to go about with a horse's head made of wood covered over with white calico and ears and lips of raw hide and a big red tongue in its mouth with iron teeth, and there were two handles to it. Then there was one of the young men taking the head in his hands, and they covered him with a white sheet, and another led him with a bridle made of straw. And the Laa'l Vain was going into the houses and pretending to bite everyone that seemed to be afraid. I remember the Laa'l Vain coming into our house many times, and it frightened the children, but if you did sit quiet, the mare would not come near you. And this, so far, is the story of Caillagh, but he goes on to give a story of Port St Mary, an unnamed pub, but let's imagine it the Albert, shall we? I've heard my father telling about one night. He was in a public house in Port St Mary at Christmas time, and there were some Irishmen in the house that knew nothing about the Laa'l Vairn. When the door opened and the Laa'l Vairn came in, the Irishmen were frightened. One got up the chimney, and the Laa'l Vairn bit his feet, and he was frightened nearly out of his senses. Doesn't Port St Mary in the 1850s sound like an amazing place to be? Amazing. Now, I mentioned that the Laa'l Vairn came about during the Caillagh Omajach, when one shouldn't work at all. But this took on particular importance on Christmas Day itself, when it was a religious obligation not to work in any way, or else you'd have to face the consequences. And a good example of this going very wrong was when some Port St Mary fishermen decided to buck that tradition and to go out fishing on the morning of Christmas Day. And they were going out for haddock, which is a ground fish, and so you'd never see it up at the surface, I'm told. However, out at sea that day, they found the haddock all out, jumping and playing on the surface. And I imagine that their excitement about this easy catch dissipated very quickly when they realised what a weird, freakish, unnatural sight this was. And correctly, because haddock was not to be found anywhere near Port St Mary for long years after this. It serves them right, I say. And this was collected by Carl Roeder, of course, and it's immediately followed in the publication by another tale of those who work on Christmas Day. And it's not located anywhere in the Isle of Man, but I would very much like to imagine it as taking place in the port, because if there was any man working on the Christmas holidays, the young men gathered around him and placed him on a hand barrow and carried him on their shoulders backwards and forwards through the village. I think we should bring this one back. Wouldn't it be great? And it would also make a brilliant Culture Vannin film as well, wouldn't it? Also, to make a brilliant Culture Vannin film would be the next tale. Now, here we get into the port itself, down to the harbour. And the story here is that two fishermen were going out late one night to check on their boat. It was low tide, and so they decided to walk across the sand towards their boat. And on the sand, they saw a hare hopping around, which was unusual. And one of the fellas mentioned to his mate that they should try and catch it. But upon hearing this, the hare then began hopping towards them. And at each hop, it grew larger and larger and larger. And at this, the two fellas ran and jumped on the closest boat. And they locked themselves in the forecastle of this boat. And they armed themselves with a hatchet and a poker there ready. And the giant hare jumped up onto the ship and was shoving against the bulkhead until it was bending. So much so that the men were frightened that the whole boat was going to be smashed into pieces. And this went on for a terrifying 3 or so hours before finally the giant hare hopped away and it wasn't seen again, thankfully. Isn't that amazing? You hear about people with rabbit problems on their land, but giant hares attacking you in the harbour. Brilliant. If anyone knows Visit Isle of Man people, then they should try selling the Isle of Man on this one. World's only unique thing. Now we've landed on a bit of an animal theme, I think, at this point. Oh no, before we go on. This normal-looking animal, which grows and grows and then attacks people, this is how it's recorded in Roeder and Farragut. But hopefully, if you've been listening, you might suspect that this could be another type of thing we've met so far this evening. Excellent, we're learning here. This is good. Now, on this animal theme, we can move on a step further along the shoreline towards Chapel Bay. And along the catwalk, we get to this cave-like thing. We'll all know it. But perhaps not everyone will be aware that it appears to have a name. Toll of Ash. And this comes from a manuscript written by a Mr. Jim Watterson, writing of the 1850s, in which we learn two things about this place. First of which is that there's an underground passage from Toll of Ash all the way underground to Port Erin. And this was discovered when a cat went into Toll of Ash and then came out by the watercourse out by the breakwater there. I have to admit that I've not actually checked this one out, but if you're looking for summer outings for the Heritage Trust, maybe this would be a good one. If the risk assessments allow, I wouldn't really know about that. And then the other thing we learn from Mr. Watterson is that at Toll of Ash, there was a Taruustia that could be found there. Or perhaps a Taruustia, because he goes on to say, he goes on to apparently translate Taruustia as a sea horse. But of course, this is not the case, and this just kind of confuses things for me, certainly, because a Taruustia is a water bull. And these are very interesting things found all over the Isle of Man. They look just like normal bulls, except they might have sparkling eyes and short ears. And they live in water, and they come out to do geel on farms, not to people, but to the cattle. They might compete and hurt the other bulls, or they might bull the cows, leading to problems with the cows going forward. A very real threat back in the rural past of the Isle of Man. And in contrast, this is the sort of threat which Taruustia threatened with just close to Ballyculferrick or at Creganish, where they were known back in the day. And in contrast to Taruustia, there is, of course, the Caillagh, which is the water horse. And here you see the confusion of this place. And the Caillagh looks, again, very like the normal animal, very much like a horse. However, it would come out of its watery home to pose at roadsides at night time, hoping that travellers might climb on their back, at which point they'd dart back into the river, drowning their passenger, who would never be seen again. And here we get to the confusion of the place, because it's not clear from the account which one is here. But both of them actually seem unlikely, because if there was a Taruustia in here, this bull, where would it find? It'd have to go quite a long way to find cattle to be meddling with. And likewise, the Caillagh, there isn't a road near here, in the days before the catwalk, of course. It doesn't really make much sense. And both of these creatures are normally associated, almost universally associated, with fresh water sources, either rivers or curraghs, marshy places. And there are very few accounts of them being found in the sea by saltwater sources. And so I think we have to conclude that we just don't know what thing used to be found here. In actual fact, I have a suspicion that it might be that rare thing, which is a sea Buggane. And you find very few of these anywhere in the Isle of Man, except for in Rushen, where you can find two of them. There is one down the gully just on the far side of Burraned, near the Sound, and more famously, there is one just at Blackhead, Caillagh Doo. And this was so well known and so feared that the Port St Mary fishermen, when they were going past here, would pour out a noggin of whiskey to placate the sea Buggane there. And so I rather suspect that it might be wise to start throwing whiskey around the catwalk as you go along there, just in case. Now, we've covered lots of things this evening, including giants, Bugganes, King Orry, Moddey Doo, Taruustia, Divination, calendar customs, etc. But glaring in its omission so far, of course, is ghosts. Because you can find ghosts everywhere in the Isle of Man. You always have done and probably always will. And if you look in the older accounts, you sometimes find writers almost annoyed by the vast number of ghost stories they have to plough through before they get to what they consider important Manx folklore. And probably everyone in the room will have a story of ghosts, either their own things they've experienced or something they know someone else has experienced. If that doesn't describe you, perhaps you need to get out more and make some friends. And there are some good ones from around the port. For instance, on that track off towards the mill at the smelt, there was a ghost once well known in the 19th century, which was a headless man accompanied by a huge black cat. What a terrifying thing to meet along this lonely path, eh? But if you do need to go out that way, I'd suggest carrying an iron cross with you just in case, because ghosts can't get past an iron cross, apparently. And we know this from a story of a blacksmith of Port St Mary who lived at Caillagh. I don't know where this place is. We have a long list of places we don't know where they are from the folklore guide, still awaiting identification. So if you know where Caillagh is, please tell me afterwards. But this blacksmith was approached by a family who'd just buried a family member in the parish graveyard. And all was well, except that this person was returning to them nightly to haunt their house, which they weren't so keen on. And so they asked the blacksmith to make this iron cross to put on the grave so that the ghost couldn't get out. And so he went along and did this, and all was well, except the blacksmith hadn't accounted on the possibility that the ghost might be out of the grave when he put the cross down. And so he was horrified when the ghost came to him there at the graveside and shouted, "Trog Shedden, lift that." And so, of course, the blacksmith lifted the cross, and the ghost, I assume, went in. And the blacksmith was so shaken by this that he never did any good work again, ever after that day. But if you're after a good place around Port St Mary for ghosts, probably the best place would be Lime Street. And there are quite a few stories from here, only two of which I'm actually talking about now because I'm running out of time. But one of them relates to a black coach, a spectral, strange black carriage, which is known to run along here. There are different versions of it, but one is that it runs at midnight from the harbour out towards the lime kilns, and it's 4 black horses pulling a black carriage, and all of them completely silent, which must be a terrifying thing to see, I think. And it runs away from the harbour out towards the point, only going in one direction, never coming back. No one knows where it comes from, where it goes, or why, which I think is very interesting. And this is a type of thing which is known elsewhere around the island, but is still seen even today. There are people living today who have seen Spurrier's coach, as it's called, driving around Peel at night. And I had a very interesting encounter with the young fellas who were working at the Venture Centre in Macclesfield. I went there to take a picture for the folklore guidebook, and in chatting to one of the young fellas, he was very interested in this road up towards the main road because he had seen one of these spectral carriages. He and his friends were wobbling back from nightlife late at night one day, walking down this road, and they were across the road wobbling about, and then they heard this horse and carriages coming up the road. So they all got to one side and let it pass. But of course, there were no lights on this thing. It was this black carriage pulled by 4 black horses. And they realised that this was not a natural thing to have seen, but they all saw it there. Very weird. And so these things are still to be seen, perhaps on Lime Street. Now, another story from here is of a fisherman who lived on the street, and he went out to put a sight on his boat late one night. But when walking down the street not far from his home, he suddenly found himself in complete darkness, and he could see nothing, but felt as if he had been in the midst of a crowd, but could feel nothing with his hands, but was carried back in the throng. And he was carried in this way a short distance until he came to a gap in the buildings, which he darted down, and suddenly was away from the crowd. And after a few moments more, the crowd had passed and the darkness lifted. And he walked home, where, of course, no one there had experienced anything like this. And this is a similar thing found elsewhere, including out at the parish church. You might find these spectral funerals with the crowds of people invisibly passing down the road. And together, I rather like these sorts of ghost stories because they're very old, but they feel like they could be told in our own time. And as I say, for Mackle, still are told in our own time. And this kind of shows, for me, how folklore isn't something from the past, but is still very much with us and should be valued in the same way. And that will lead me to my final story, you'll probably be glad to know. And this, I think, is quite a nice story to sum up everything, I think. And of course, for this, we'll go back to Balacragan and the crossroads. But we start a little bit further out by Kentraw, because there's a fella named Madrill coming back from Castletown towards his home at Fisted around about 11 p.m. on a very, very wet, windy, stormy night. And just at the bottom of the hill by Kentraw, where lots of other very unusual things have happened, he found himself walking alongside a young woman who came up and walked beside him. And he was very surprised at this young woman walking on such a night at such a late hour. And so he asked her various questions, but she never said a word in return. And after the long walk all the way to Balacragan, he realised that this was not a normal flesh and blood person. And so when he turned down towards the port and she turned with him, he realised he needed to do something. And so he bravely turned to her and said, "If you don't tell me who you are, I'll make a sacrifice of you by God." And at that, she grinned up into his face and then was gone like a flash of lightning. And what I like about this is that there was this woman. Who knows where she came from, where she went, who she was, what she was. And she was only there for a short period of time, but she obviously affected this Madrill fella enough that he told this story to others, and it's been passed on to us in our time. And this sort of story, certainly for me, changes how I relate to the landscape around me. These sorts of stories teach us that this place where we call home is a place which isn't just ours. It's a place which resonates with meanings and stories stretching back hundreds and hundreds of years. And we can count ourselves very lucky to live in a place like this. Good am I.